The territory of Spain today covers nearly 195,365 square miles and is mainly located on the Iberian Peninsula. It shares borders with Portugal to the west and France to the north, along with the tiny Principality of Andorra. Spain also governs the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean Sea and the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, in addition to the two small enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla on the northern coast of Morocco. Yet at the beginning of the 19th century, the lands claimed by Spain stretched across more than 5 million square miles. Its empire extended across almost the whole of the Americas, from California down to Argentina, and even across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines in Eastern Asia. Although this represented the height of Spain's territorial reach, many of these lands had been conquered during the previous 3 centuries in one of the most astonishing and rapid rises to power ever achieved by a nation. This is the story of how Spain became the world's first true superpower. Music. During the second half of the 15th century, Spain as we know it did not officially exist. At that time the Iberian Peninsula was divided into several Christian kingdoms. The most powerful among them were the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon. Over the previous 700 years, these kingdoms had slowly reclaimed territory from the Moors, the Muslim invaders from North Africa who had conquered much of Iberia during the early 8th century. In 1469, in an effort to unite their realms through a dynastic alliance and strengthen Christian authority in the region, Queen Isabella I of Castile married King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Together they effectively established a joint rule over a newly unified Spain. With their kingdoms combined, Isabella and Ferdinand completed the Reconquista by defeating the last Muslim state on the peninsula, the Emirate of Granada, in 1492. Having secured their homeland, the Catholic monarchs now turned their attention overseas, hoping to profit from the growing trade routes leading to the wealthy and exotic lands beyond Europe. This strategy had already been embraced by neighboring Portugal during the early 15th century. Portuguese explorers had sailed along much of the Atlantic Ocean and the coast of Africa searching for a quicker and cheaper sea route to the spice-rich East Indies. They hoped this would allow them to bypass the expensive Venetian and Ottoman middlemen who dominated trade into Europe through the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It was during this period that a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus arrived in the late 1480s with a bold proposal for a western sea route to Asia. Columbus was already an experienced navigator and promoted the idea that instead of sailing around Africa, Asia could be reached by traveling westward across the Atlantic Ocean and around the globe. He believed a vast uninterrupted ocean separated Europe from the East Indies. Columbus first approached King John II of Portugal in the early 1480s seeking support for the expedition, but his request was rejected. News of Columbus's proposal eventually reached the court of Isabella and Ferdinand, who were eager to match the commercial success of Portugal and establish overseas trade routes of their own. They agreed to sponsor the voyage. After years of negotiations and preparations, Columbus finally departed on the 3rd of August 1492 with 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After more than 2 months at sea, the expedition reached land on the morning of October 12. Columbus named the island San Salvador, believing he had arrived in the East Indies. Because of this misunderstanding, he referred to the native inhabitants as Indians. The expedition continued exploring the region, mapping much of the Bahamas, northern Cuba, and Hispaniola before returning to Spain in January 1493 carrying news that previously unknown lands had been discovered. Back in Europe, Isabella and Ferdinand were thrilled by the discoveries and quickly organized a second expedition for Columbus, this time consisting of 17 ships. During this voyage he explored much more of the Caribbean, while a third expedition between 1498 and 1500 led to the first European contact with mainland South America. At this stage Columbus realized he had discovered an entirely unknown continent. On his fourth and final voyage beginning in 1502, he sailed along much of the coastline of Central America. Although Columbus died in 1506 disappointed that he had not found the western route to Asia he originally sought, he had nevertheless set into motion events that would permanently transform world history. Following Columbus's discoveries, tensions quickly developed between Spain and Portugal over who would control these newly found territories. To settle the dispute, the Treaty of Tordesillas was negotiated with Pope Alexander VI acting as mediator. Signed on June 7, 1494, The treaty divided the non-European world into two spheres of influence, one Spanish and one Portuguese. At the time it was believed that nearly all of the Americas would belong to Spain, though it was later discovered that Brazil fell within Portugal's allotted zone. Even while the treaty was being finalized, Spain had already begun establishing permanent colonies in the New World. The first major settlement was Santo Domingo, founded in 1496 on Hispaniola by Bartholomew Columbus, Christopher's brother, in what is today the Dominican Republic. From there Spanish settlements spread rapidly across the Caribbean during the early 1500s. Cuba became the center of the expanding Spanish Empire after its conquest in 1515 and the establishment of Havana. Meanwhile, exploration of the American mainland continued. In 1513 the explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. Spain's growing presence in the Caribbean soon became the launching point for a larger imperial expansion. The great centers of Native American civilization were located on the mainland, especially in Central America, where advanced societies such as the Maya and the Olmecs had flourished for thousands of years. By the time the Spanish arrived, the most powerful state in the region was the Aztec Empire, which ruled much of present-day Mexico from its capital city of Tenochtitlan, a massive city built on a lake and connected by huge man-made causeways. The Spanish initially explored the Yucatan Peninsula in 1517, but reports soon spread of a wealthy and powerful empire farther west. Motivated by these stories, the conquistador Hernán Cortés departed from Havana with a small expedition in 1518 and reached the Mexican coast shortly afterward. In 1519 Cortés founded the settlement of Veracruz, which became his base along the Gulf Coast. From there he marched inland, forming alliances with native enemies of the Aztecs such as the Tlaxcalans, who had suffered under Aztec domination for generations. In November 1519 Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma too cautiously welcomed the Spanish, viewing them with both fascination and fear. Some believed these armored strangers carrying unfamiliar weapons might be divine beings, while others suspected dangerous intentions. Cortés soon attempted to seize control of the city by detaining Montezuma and calling for reinforcements from the Caribbean. For several months the Spanish remained in control, but tensions between the occupiers and the local population rapidly worsened. On June 29, 1520 Montezuma was killed while attempting to calm his people. The following night, remembered as La Noche Triste or the Sad Night, Cortés and his men were driven from Tenochtitlan while losing much of the treasure they had collected. Despite the disaster, Cortés managed to regroup his forces, which included fewer than 1,000 Spaniards and thousands of native allies. During the winter of 1520 he prepared for another assault. By the following spring his army marched back toward Tenochtitlan, surrounding the city and beginning a siege that lasted 10 weeks. The fall of Tenochtitlan effectively destroyed the Aztec civilization. European diseases such as smallpox, unknowingly introduced by the Spanish, devastated the native population, who had no natural immunity. Millions died from epidemics even before facing Spanish armies and their native allies. The Tlaxcalans in particular were determined to erase Aztec power. During the sack of the city they looted and destroyed much of Tenochtitlan while slaughtering countless inhabitants. In the aftermath the city was rebuilt as Mexico City, which became the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Mexico was not the only center of advanced civilization in the Americas. Farther south in the Andes Mountains, ancient societies such as the Chavin and Nazca had flourished for centuries. By the arrival of the Spanish, the dominant power in the region was the Inca Empire, which controlled much of modern Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Spanish contact with the Incas began in the mid-1520s. Soon afterward two conquistadors, Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, launched expeditions into Peru hoping to conquer the wealthy empire. Their first attempt in 1528 achieved little success. However, as in Mexico, European diseases like smallpox spread ahead of the invaders and weakened resistance among the native population. Pizarro returned in 1531 with royal authorization to conquer the Inca Empire. What followed was a prolonged conflict lasting through much of the 1530s. Unlike Cortés in Mexico, Pizarro did not achieve a quick victory because the Inca Empire was larger, more decentralized, and geographically difficult to control. The Spanish themselves were also divided. Rivalries developed between supporters of Pizarro and the followers of Almagro, leading to violent conflict among the conquistadors even while they fought the Incas. Pizarro himself was assassinated in 1541 by followers of Diego de Almagro II. By then Spain had already secured control over much of Peru and established Lima as the new colonial capital. In 1542 the Viceroyalty of Peru was officially created as a counterpart to New Spain. Yet Inca resistance continued well into the 1570s. The conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires formed the foundation of Spain's dominance in the Americas during the 16th century, though expansion continued elsewhere as well. During the late 1530s the explorer Hernando de Soto led expeditions through the northern frontier of New Spain. He traveled across regions that now form the southern United States, including Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Advanced mound-building cultures lived there in settlements such as Itoa and Cahokia. Although de Soto returned with valuable information, Spain made little effort to fully colonize these northern regions for many decades, aside from a few settlements in Florida and southern Texas. More attractive and accessible lands closer to Mexico City remained the priority. Farther south, the explorer Juan Díaz de Solís charted the mouth of the Rio de la Plata in 1516 around present-day Argentina and Uruguay. 20 years later Pedro de Mendoza established Buenos Aires on February 2, 1536. Yet much of Argentina and neighboring Chile remained largely untouched by Spanish settlement for generations. Spanish expansion throughout the Americas happened gradually and remained focused mainly on Mexico and Peru. At the same time Spain also established a colony far across the Pacific Ocean. During Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation between 1519 and 1522, islands in Eastern Asia were discovered that technically fell within Spain's side of the boundary established by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Further exploration during the 1540s led these islands to be named Las Islas Filipinas in honor of Prince Philip, heir to the Spanish throne. After Philip became King Philip II in 1556, a military expedition was sent to establish Spanish control in the Philippines during the 1560s. The large northern island of Luzon was quickly conquered and Manila was founded in 1571. However, Spain faced fierce resistance from Muslim communities on Mindanao and nearby islands. As in the Americas, Spanish rule over the Philippines remained incomplete from the very beginning. Even so, the colony provided Spain with an important strategic foothold in Asia and the East Indies. As Spain's empire expanded throughout the 16th century, enormous wealth was needed to maintain control over these distant territories. Fortunately for the crown, huge deposits of gold and silver were soon discovered in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. Spain mined these resources extensively while exploiting native labor, especially at locations such as Potosi in Bolivia, where a massive silver mountain discovered in 1545 supplied much of the world's silver for centuries. This precious metal was transported across the empire to ports such as Cartagena before being shipped back to Spain in heavily guarded treasure fleets. The flood of bullion pouring into Europe caused widespread inflation during the late 16th century, a phenomenon known as the Price Revolution. As more settlers arrived from Spain, colonial society became increasingly complex. Most migrants were single men, often younger sons of noble families seeking wealth in the New World. Since relatively few Spanish women emigrated, many settlers married native women. Over time, a mixed-race population known as mestizos emerged across the empire. Spanish became the dominant language while Catholicism shaped nearly every aspect of colonial life. Beginning in the late 16th century, African slaves were also transported in growing numbers, especially to the Caribbean where sugar plantations demanded large labor forces. Despite the immense wealth flowing from the colonies, by the early 17th century the amount of gold and silver reaching Spain had begun to decline. At the same time, the Spanish monarchy spent vast sums fighting wars throughout Europe. King Philip II was forced to declare bankruptcy multiple times during his reign. Mismanagement and declining revenues gradually weakened the empire. By then, Spanish expansion in the Americas had mostly stalled because no other large native empires remained to conquer. Meanwhile, the French, Dutch, and English increasingly occupied territories in North America that Spain had claimed but failed to settle effectively. These rival powers also challenged Spanish dominance in the Caribbean. England, for example, captured Jamaica during the Anglo-Spanish War of the mid-17th century. All of this reflected the growing stagnation of the Spanish Empire during that era. By the beginning of the 18th century, Spanish colonial society had matured. Settlements now stretched from northern Mexico all the way to Chile and Argentina. Some regions, such as the Atacama Desert and the jungles of Guyana, remained largely unexplored and sparsely populated. However, California and Texas attracted growing attention during the late 18th century. In California, the Franciscan missionary Junipero Serra and his followers established a chain of missions beginning in the late 1760s. These settlements later developed into major cities such as San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Meanwhile, tensions were growing within the core regions of the empire. Colonial society had become divided into three broad groups. The Peninsulars were officials born in Spain. The Creoles were people of pure Spanish ancestry born in the Americas. Finally, the Mestizos were individuals of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage. Over time, many Creoles and Mestizos increasingly believed the colonies would prosper more under self-rule rather than continued control from Spain. Although the empire had stagnated by the late 18th century, it had not yet collapsed. The final blow would come from Europe itself. By 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. This triggered uprisings throughout Latin America led by figures such as José de San Martín in Argentina, Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, Simón Bolívar in Venezuela and Colombia, and Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico. Between 1808 and 1810, wars of independence erupted across Spanish America as revolutionaries sought to exploit Spain's weakness under French occupation. However, they faced strong opposition from royalists and pro-Spanish factions, especially the Peninsulars. As a result, these wars became long and brutal struggles lasting throughout the 1810s. Even after King Ferdinand VII regained the Spanish throne in 1813, Spain continued sending military aid to suppress the rebellions. Nevertheless, Simón Bolívar achieved major victories in Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama, leading to the creation of Gran Colombia in 1819, formally recognized in 1821. Bolívar later marched south and helped liberate Peru after victory at the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824. Meanwhile, José de San Martín secured Argentina's independence in 1816 while Chile declared independence in 1818, though fighting there continued until 1826. In the north, Mexico finally broke away from Spain in 1821 after more than a decade of warfare. The revolutions of the early 19th century destroyed nearly all of Spain's overseas empire. Only a few territories remained under Spanish control, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Spain guarded these final colonies closely as the last remnants of its former greatness. Yet political instability within Spain weakened its ability to maintain control. Throughout the 19th century, nationalist movements and guerrilla warfare spread through the remaining colonies. Eventually, the Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895, marked the beginning of the empire's final collapse. The conflict ultimately drew in the United States in 1898. The resulting Spanish-American War was brief but disastrous for Spain. Defeated by the United States, Spain surrendered Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, ending centuries of imperial rule. And so the once vast and immensely wealthy Spanish Empire, born from the accidental voyage of a Genoese sailor, finally disappeared after 400 years of history.